Good evening, and thank you all for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be here for a conversation with Paul and Herb. They join us tonight to discuss how blockchain is being applied to the social sector and how its use is changing global governance. Before I speak with them, though, I wanted to spend a minute or two addressing the question of, to speak in broad layman's terms about what blockchain is and why it's such a big deal these days. Now, my industry, which is technology, kind of does itself no favors by acting like it creates these sudden, futuristic, magical objects that sort of fall out of the sky from nowhere and transform everybody's lives. The reality is that the future shows up consisting 99% of the past. But then that 1% can have an enormous difference sometimes. Sometimes that might be the internal combustion engine replacing the horse or imposing the internet across phone networks, and the 1% changes everything. In the case of blockchain, we have a potentially global system of what are called distributed ledgers. Let's just stop right there and underline that ledgers are an age-old way to keep accounts, and the real-time distribution of information across big areas is something we've been doing in one form or another since at least the telegraph. So there's nothing too weird here at first. As you dig in, blockchain takes those familiar items of account keeping and information sharing and puts them on a whole new level. The reason why is because of something truly extraordinary that is going on these days. Thanks to things like smartphones, cheap connected laptops, and large public data centers like Google Cloud, my employer, we are in an age where almost every habitable point on Earth can potentially access a nearly infinite amount of computing at power, and that is changing much of our lives. Using a lot of complicated math and clever software, a blockchain, and there are many, many kinds of blockchains one might establish, can gain amongst total strangers distributed across the world a ledger that verifies identities, agreements, and actions, all while, if they wish, keeping the participants anonymous. Or so runs the theory. As we will get into tonight, no doubt, the idea does have its detractors. Now think of what a big deal this might be. For ages, companies relied on things like letters of credit, near strangers, vaguely trusted and tenuous relationships, incompatible terms of service, considering all of their manufacture and transport. Now they might identify each other instantaneously and hold to their agreements. With blockchain, they could gain real awareness of manufacture globally at all times. Individuals might have enforceable one-time contracts with anyone in the world. Counterfeit luxury goods and fake drugs would be much harder to produce, since the real deal would come with an audit trail verifying its creation and provenance. In 2016, the blockchain was recognized as one of the top 10 emerging technologies by the World Economic Forum. Probably $700 million or more have been invested in it, and over 2,500 patents have been established in blockchain technology. And then, of course, there's Bitcoin, which many of you have heard of, I'm sure. It is a currency created inside a system of ledgers, its authenticity created by more math, very hard stuff designed to limit supply. And its value is not backed by any government, but by the willingness of the people participating in the system to believe in it and to trade in it. It's been a little volatile. I checked, and today at 2:50 a.m. it was $9,714. And then at 2 in the afternoon, it was $8,814. So it had a 9.3% drop in 12 hours that it then recovered mostly in the next 4 or 5 hours. So not as stable as many things, but that may be worked out. But potentially it's a really big deal. If you think about government as something that sets and maintains a country's borders, you can start to see why Bitcoin, and by extension blockchain, really starts to change things around. Governments essentially are about the borders they keep and maintain. They used to issue local and then international stamps that said where the border began and ended. But then the internet hammered that control with email. Social networks began to affect politics across borders. Other forms of border control have started to erode. And in Bitcoin, you have a currency that is no longer backed by any one state and respects no particular border. That is another significant implication that I hope we cover tonight. Bring it on, say our guests, or at least learn to live with it because the blockchain is not going away. So, on that note, let me introduce Paul Lamb, principal of Man on a Mission Consulting, a management consulting firm that looks at ways nonprofits and aid agencies, along with foundations and others, can use digital currencies and blockchain both for funding and for social impact. And Herb Stevens, co-founder and treasurer of Democracy Earth Foundation, a group that calls itself a borderless peer-to-peer democracy for everyone anywhere. And you thought you had ambitions. It also uses this line, which I like a lot. We are 21st century citizens interacting with 19th century institutions based on 15th century information technology. Remember what I said about the future consisting mostly of the past? I think he wants to shake that up a little bit. So let me just start with you, Herb, and then you, Paul. Talk a little bit about what your organizations do and address the question, what does blockchain tell us about the world today?
Well, first of all, thanks for being, it's great being here. Thanks for having me. Our organization, first of all, is we're a nonprofit here in California. We're very international. There's 12 full-time staff members, but hundreds that contribute to open source free software that we create. Essentially, we're trying to improve democracy globally. Essentially, we see that as a corruption problem. Right, and these days everything is electronic. Even the ballots that we vote on start out electronic, oddly enough, then they're printed, and then they're put back in electronic form, and they're going back and forth. So just like our currency, even the dollars, most countries, Sweden, for example, doesn't take much paper. It's all electronic. So we have a digitization of everything. So, but that starts right there with these databases. Every time our finger touches a mobile device or we enter a browser, we're putting information into a database. And today those databases are corruptible, meaning every database is centralized, what we call centralized, and has 4 basic functions: create, read, update, and delete. And we're now moving to a world that's really incorruptible, this centralized world to a decentralized one, where these databases are out there in the public sphere, where you eliminate the update and delete, and you really just have create and read. So the things that are important in society out there, like voting and like currencies, will move from these corruptible centralized databases to these decentralized incorruptible databases, or blockchains.
We need to crawl into the weeds just a little bit there. Who maintains these databases, and how can we be assured they won't be corrupted?
That's a very good question. Essentially, I like to, my blockchain 101 is to think about blockchains as a spreadsheet. Most of us have sort of been involved with spreadsheets. You can think of a column A and then B, C, and it keeps going to the right, and then rows 1, 2, 3, and it keeps going below. So when you think of Bitcoin, think of it right now, it's a little over 500,000 columns. That's every 10 minutes a new column is created. And every transaction or public key is a row. So, thinking about blockchains as these, these ledgers, what happens is you're able to maintain history in voting, as well as what you're building is consensus. So rather than being a centralized database that could be corrupted, now it's out there in a world where you see the history, and voting can not only happen at a point in time, but will be sort of always on, if you will.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's a collectively owned database.
It
and
is.
A collectively maintained
Everyone has
database.
a copy of it. The very nature of blockchains is rather than one copy being centralized, everyone has a copy of it. So by nature, it becomes incorruptible.
That can't be hacked.
That hasn't been hacked. If you look at any of the blockchains out there, to date, Bitcoin being the biggest one, never has it been hacked, right? And what's interesting is we're entering a world where we're actually going to be able to reverse, if you will, right? Because you have this history, for example, the presidential election here, what if we determine, because we have the history, that a certain percentage of those really were cast by Russia, let's say? We could, as a society, now back up to that point in time, right, and fork there, if you will. Mm-hmm. Right? And sort of like now that the history's out there and we have that auditable trail. I'm an ex-auditor. I worked for GE Capital for a number of years. So I understand, auditing and that the value of having that history that right now we don't have.
So leveling that up a bit, what does this tell us about the world, where we've been and where we're going?
Well, it tells us that this has just been a natural evolution of the internet, right? The centralization of the internet is, you know, as a technologist, when you're looking at a screen, it's just a number of choices. We're voting every single time we click something, right? Behind it, it's just a bunch of links. And to a technologist, is that person just voted? So they're just constantly putting choices up there. Right now, those choices are accruing to others, like Google, like Facebook, like jurisdictions, and that value isn't accruing to the individuals, right? And so with blockchains, you're gonna start to see that value not accrue to those organizations, but to those individuals, and those individuals are gonna have the keys to the otherwise corruptible public data right now.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah, so most of the work that I do is in this area that is loosely referred to as technology for the social good. So looking at how technology can be applied to the social sector, how it can make change in a variety of ways, you know, positive change. And you asked the question of you know, how blockchain impacts the world, and it's huge. You know, Herb alluded to a number of things, but it's across all sectors, right? If we're talking about the financial sector, supply chain management, law, accounting, it's all being affected by this new technology we call blockchain. And again, this notion of something that is decentralized, right? It allows for peer-to-peer communications. You eliminate the middleman, something that is extremely secure, more secure than anything we've seen when it comes to databases. And the fact that, you know, there are all these applications. What's interesting to me, going back to your question, is, again, if we look at the social sector, where and how can blockchain be applied to make a difference? And there are a number of examples, again, governance being, and democracy being one of them, but also refugees, providing identities for, you know, the 65 million refugees that in many cases lack identities, and the blockchain providing a record and the ability to create an identity and track an identity that is no longer there. Financial inclusion is another one for the 2 billion people across the world who are unbanked. International aid, there are a whole host of different applications in the social sector that really excite me. Early days, and there's more, I think, heat than fire just yet, but that is going to change.
Do you like all the publicity that Bitcoin has received, or is this problematic?
Well, as a Bitcoin owner, full disclosure, yes and no. It'll maybe bring more people.
Did you buy it at 19,000 or did you buy it at 11 cents?
Neither.
Okay.
I won't disclose when I bought it. But more seriously, I think the challenge with that is that all of this focus on Bitcoin takes away from blockchain and all the innovation that's happening with blockchain. Bitcoin is just the tip of the iceberg. When you start to dig in and see again how this technology can be applied in so many ways, it's astounding. There's just incredible innovation and transformation, and that's, again, I think what interests me, and I know interests her.
You mentioned something called crypto philanthropy. What is it and why should it exist?
Yeah, so this term crypto philanthropy generally refers to leveraging cryptocurrencies and the blockchain for philanthropy. And it ranges, there's a spectrum, everything from making Bitcoin donations to a nonprofit or an NGO, which is pretty easily done these days, although it's not as common as you see with other forms of donations. Everything from creating what are called charity coins or social purpose coins, where nonprofits and other social sector organizations can put their own cryptocurrencies out there to generate money and create new donor ecosystems with these tokens as well as the cryptocurrencies. And then you can get into things like measuring social impact, because you can track where donations are going. And new systems are being developed around that, again, to track the money flow as well as to measure the impact of those donations.
But the deep message is that we have these new kinds of systems of awareness that disintermediate or dislodge the people, sometimes corrupt, sometimes distant, often suspect, who had controlled what amounted to awareness or the best thing you could get towards it, your currency, your communications. And this creates this new world where supposedly it is more transparent. This is what you're doing, Herb, when you talk about borderless democracy. And, well, to both of you, I suppose, but I'll start with you, Herb. What is borderless democracy, and how can that exist and not just be another layer on all the existing governments?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, one important thing that we don't have today that I think we need as a world is global voting, right? The UN kind of doesn't work as an institution, and there are a lot of issues out there, environmental probably being the number one, where we need to kind of vote as a world. So right there, physical borders start to get in the way. One of the elections we worked on recently was in Colombia, and that was the peace referendum that they had this last year. And there, if you think about that war that went on for 52 years there, essentially the FARC against the government, and then when the new government was elected, they said to the FARC, you know, how can we have peace? And they started to come to terms, and the old government basically rose up and said, no, we don't negotiate with terrorists. So it became this three-way battle. Well, the interesting thing there is over the 52 years, 6 million people had left Colombia, right? A lot of the brain drain, right? And so, and this has happened all over the world with people forced out. It's happening in Syria today, right? I think if you had asked the locals in Syria, they would want all these people that are scattered around the world to vote locally, right? And the same with Colombia is they wanted to reach out to the 6 million people that have fled the country and said, what do you think? And not only that is, after what happened at Brexit, they were very concerned of how the 14 to 18-year-olds felt, right? Now, they're not registered to vote, but they have a phone and they can be reached. So we help them to use the internet to go out and reach these 6 million expats and these 14 to 18-year-olds, and not just yes-no vote like everyone else was forced into, but we were able to divide it into the 8 different issues that were actually driving it and determine that it was just one of those, representation in Congress, that flipped it from a yes to a no. Now, they were able to take that data, work it back in, and then eventually get a yes. But there's a very good example where this borderless democracy is, the world is operating on the internet, and that is very much borderless, right? Our goods are flowing over the internet. We're traveling, and we're migrating and moving all over, yet we're constrained by these geographic borders. And that's where the friction starts to occur.
So are you saying that the nation state will continue but kind of extend itself on this virtual space where expatriates and minors or whatever begin to become participants in the democracy? Or does this create a global democracy that eventually sort of erodes away the nation state?
You know, what's funny is when you take away the border, let's say the United States, right? You don't end up with fewer, you end up with more. You end up with 50, right?
Yes.
Right, so it's interesting. The more you get rid of borders, the more you get. So I see it a little differently. I think one of the first big waves of the internet was the globalization, and now we're seeing a real localization, right? Where you don't have to depend on a faraway government for your currency or some of the services you otherwise could, but you get them right on your smartphone locally. And that's going to enable one of the fundamental things that we support, and basically one of our touchstones is sort of the First Amendment right to organize and petition the government, right? And that starts at the lowest levels. That starts with a few people with a phone getting together, like Occupy Wall Street, let's say, starting for a cause and being able to take that up the chains of democracy.
And if I could just add to that, I see it in 2 different ways. One, very much like Herb, I think this notion of global government and fluid democracy is really exciting. I mean, could you imagine the citizens of the United States and the citizens of Mexico deciding they were going to vote on whether we should build this wall or not? Okay, it's really a decision of the people instead of one administration or one government or another. Things like that could be very, very powerful. But I think also going back to the database functionality of blockchain, guaranteeing the legitimacy of voting is another way that we can leverage this powerful new technology. We can record the votes. We can make sure that the votes are legitimate. And just to give an example, it didn't get a lot of press, but last month, the government of Sierra Leone actually had an experiment. There was an organization that leveraged blockchain to track the voting in part of the country, not the whole country. But they said, we're going to use blockchain to count and make sure that this vote is a legitimate one. Interestingly enough, the numbers that they came up with were different than the numbers the government came up with. That's not to say who is right or wrong. I don't know. But again, the power of really tracking this and having an audit trail and legitimizing votes, which connect, definitely with what Herb was talking about, in a global fashion, in a fluid fashion, that's tremendously powerful.
Do you think of this as a high trust world or a low trust world that this is operating in?
I think it takes away the need for trust.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
literally, in this peer-to-peer world, you're not relying on that third party, even that institution, right? It's literally eliminates that need for trust, and that's the whole point.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost an irrelevant question.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and I think these, Paul was talking about the different forms of democracy. I think that, first the corruption, and then we can be a little creative with our democracy. And what that means is we've seen a lot of participation in democracies. We've looked at all the graphs, and we've seen it decline and decline and decline, and we're at roughly 50% and going lower. And we think that's a result of, the lack of accountability and the amount of corruption. But we also see it, an amazing, promise here, right, for the future.
Well, if we look at the U.S. elections, there's an increasingly convincing case that it wasn't about economics per se that attracted voters to Trump. It was that people had a hard time, they felt displaced, and they had a hard time seeing themselves in this world to come. And that really resonated with me because I read some history where these things are concerned. And one of the great displacements in history was caused by the printing press. When people could print freely, that was 1456 about, and it really got going in the 1490s when they figured out how to make this work at scale. 1510, the Catholic Church has its first book burning. 1519, Martin Luther starts translating the Bible into German. They can't burn it fast enough. The train has left the station. The Protestant Reformation gets underway. And this eventually causes the Catholic Church to be somewhat displaced, first by Protestant religions, then by kings and empires that raise in power, but also start to encounter this kind of nationalistic function. We don't need to get into why, but it also has to do with print and vernacular speech. Anyway, the long and the short of that is, in that next 100 years, 150 years, the population of Germany fell by a third because of violence. There was so much warfare as the existing order gave way to this new order because, at the core there was this new technology. And I look at people baffled by this world. I look at nationalism, not just, in this country, but in so many places, in Brexit. I looked at the anti-immigrant backlash, the strong men people seem to vote for. Do you think is blockchain emblematic that we're in a period now of great transition? Can it help? Is it part of the problem? Do you think this is just a temporary disjuncture?
That's a big question.
Well, yeah. This is the World Affairs Council.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I hope blockchain does not cause thousands of deaths as the printing press did.
The scenario will be different, obviously, but the turmoil and the sense of displacement is definitely acute right now.
Yep.
People don't understand who they are in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I do think when you mentioned the election, I do think it's more of an economic issue than a political issue, like why Trump was elected. And I do see, Bitcoin I don't think is the solution, but we are going to see a cryptocurrency, and I think, in the near future, most fiat currencies are going to be converted to to cryptocurrencies in the coming years, and probably sooner than most people think.
And you think that will compel governments to be more transparent because
Well,
they'll
it'll
be
force
auditable?
them to, right? Right now, even relying on the US dollar, like how many are out there? You hear stories of how many have been printed, and are they traceable? And where was it? Was it just used in a crime? You really, when you look at what fuels crime organizations, it's cash.
There's a
right?
great statistic on how many $100 bills have trace amounts of cocaine on them. It's a really large number.
Yeah, I heard that number. It was like 85% in New York
Yeah.
City. And
Yeah.
I don't know what that says about New York City, but I think it says
Stays up late.
I think it says more about, cash, and society, moving away from what can be a real source of crime or fuel of crime to blockchains where you have audit trails, and I think we'll see a lot less crime with our currencies.
Yep.
So this is a helpful thing where this is concerned in the confusion we're in today.
Oh, absolutely. And I also think we're going to see a bit of a economic reset where Bitcoin hasn't been distributed properly, right? It's not solving any of our currency issues. You're either early or you're rich, and you've got Bitcoin, right? Yeah. So a new currency is going to emerge that's actually going to be distributed, much like resetting a Monopoly game, right? It's going to be like granted out there fairly, and then it's going to be the liquidity that society needs right now.
And that's already occurring. I mean, there's some experiments around universal basic income using cryptocurrency or tokens. And the idea is that, as you said, Herb, you spread it around evenly. And this is a new form of currency, not just cryptocurrency, but social currency, right? Where we can lift everyone up simultaneously. And that's very different.
You see it with what they call airdrops, right? It's typically where, you want to get people to use your currency? Just send them a bunch, right? And then they're going to start using it, right? The same principle. Right now, I would argue that both our political voice as well as our economic voice, we have no liquidity. Guy Standing is a University of London professor, one of the world's foremost experts in universal basic income. One of his recent books is The Corruption of Capitalism. Essentially, the takeaway is it doesn't pay to work anymore. And if you think that we're voting with our dollars, it's just not true, right? We're working and we're working and we're working, we're still going sideways or upside down.
But
right?
to play devil's advocate, Bitcoin is the preeminent use of a blockchain in the world today.
Yes.
Mt. Gox, people got ripped off for tens of millions of dollars. Pirate Bay, an eBay for selling illicit drugs frequently to minors. The Venezuelan coin, you can get into that a bit, you know more than I do. Not a good thing. And again, it's become problematic. And the mining of Bitcoin has turned into this horrible energy sink where a coal-fired plant in Australia is being revved up again for the sole purpose of mining Bitcoin, throwing more carbon in the air. Fantastic, guys.
There's a deeper story than that, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you needed to put it in perspective. And remember that all technologies can be used for good or bad purposes. Right?
Technology is neutral, but this starts to sound a little bit like economics. Fantastic in theory, then we tried to apply it. Oh my God.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, as you said, there are all these scandals and nefarious uses of Bitcoin that get a lot of attention. But the amount of Bitcoin that's used for nefarious purposes is a drop in the bucket of cash, and there's no comparison there. The other thing that I think is important to remember.
Cash had a head start.
It did have a little bit of a head start. There are a lot of negative factors, like you said, the energy use or the waste of energy on the so-called mining of Bitcoin. But you also have to go back to the early days of the internet. Until we hit the social media era, pornography was the overwhelming use of the internet, right? This is very early days with blockchain. It has good and bad applications. Another bad application, for example, is if bad actors are managing blockchains, right? For example, gathering information on people, identity, etc. They can use that information for bad purposes, for human rights abuses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to look at both sides. But again, we have to remember that this is a technology. It's very early days, and you know, it's something that we have to do, or there's one of the missing pieces here. I would argue is that we don't have good governance structures for cryptocurrencies or blockchain yet. You know, we have limited use cases. We don't have, you know, a lot of best practices. It's just like artificial intelligence. People started looking at the ethics of this. Similarly, we have to look at the ethics of cryptocurrencies and blockchain.
Did you want to add to that? Where Bitcoin is concerned, it's our primary
Yeah.
example of the blockchain, and it's
Yeah, absolutely.
got some problems.
Well, yeah, and the power consumption is a problem, right? But keep in mind, it is one of 1,500 cryptocurrencies, and that the way the consensus is built, and keep in mind, I mentioned it's a spreadsheet earlier, that this is how the next block is agreed upon, is through CPU power. There's other ways to build consensus other than using computing power, and that's most of the other blockchains are going in that direction, which is a proof of stake. It's
Okay.
almost like, all right, everybody, do we agree? We agree. It's more of a networked way of building consensus than, you know, pure raw, you know, computing power going against mathematical problems, right? So, and those are not only bringing that consumption almost down to zero, but then the transaction cost is coming to zero as well, right? Like Lightning Networks and EOS and some of these other newer blockchains that are addressing some of these issues. So that's being solved. We are early, but it will be solved and is being solved.
As I stand at some distance to this, or try to anyway, I do wonder though, is this another example of a way in which we're turning over the future to technologists?
You know,
You know, they're the new masters if
Yeah.
they're running this.
yeah, I don't think so. I think right now, like I said, every time we touch that screen, we're hitting databases, and those are centralized. So I just see this as a shift to less corruptible databases.
We're kind of already there, but it's going to get better through this method.
Yeah, and we're going to see, just like right now, you don't think about databases when you're working. You know, you're not going to think about blockchains in years to come, right? It's going to be technology in the background that it's just a different way in which we're operating.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, you have to look at the good and the bad again. You know, if you think of examples, again, going back to the social impact of blockchain, one of the use cases of blockchain in terms of international aid is providing a more transparent way for that money to move from the donor or the donor countries to the NGOs or the recipients, which is, you know, a wonderful use of the technology. Many
Remittances
technologists,
is what he's talking about. Remittances. It's the biggest industry in the world
Well,
today. You know, sending money from one family member to another. The
Right.
biggest industry in the world today, and it eats up like way too much of their earnings in this process today.
Right. It's both remittances and international aid.
Mm-hmm.
But many of my friends who are technologists who are working in and around blockchain and cryptocurrencies who don't have experience with NGOs or nonprofit work seem to think that we can just eliminate NGOs. And I think we will see, to a certain extent, elimination of some of the middlemen, or a transformation in how the middlemen do their work.
Why would you want to eliminate NGOs?
And that's my point, is that, you know, you still want someone on the ground distributing blankets
Yeah, I mean,
and helping people directly face to face. The argument from, and this goes back to your question about, you know, aren't we just technologizing the whole world and creating a
my point
romance
is,
around technology?
It's a transfer of power from politicians to technologists.
Right.
I see
And
it
is
as
that
a
really
transfer
healthy?
of power to the people. Now,
I would
one
agree.
thing we have to keep in mind too, that when you think of this spreadsheet in those rows, what's in that row, that identifier is something called a public key, right? And the whole thing with a digital wallet, and this is one of the key parts of blockchains, right, is understanding digital wallets. Whoever has the private keys to that public key can move that balance, right? And so what I see is this is a movement to someone else having the keys to our stuff, to people having the keys to their stuff. Keys to their vote, keys to their assets, keys to their stocks, keys to you know, every bit of asset there is out there. And rather than write today, those keys, none of us have the keys to our stuff right now.
So that the political reality becomes enormous personal empowerment.
It's a power to the people movement.
That's the positive argument.
When Satoshi Nakamoto came out with the Bitcoin protocol, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary, October 31st, 2008. In it is a social movement in of itself. It's very readable, and I suggest everyone read it. Yeah. But it's a social movement in itself. So,
okay. Let me take a couple questions from the audience. The first one says, in 2007, the prediction was that social would radically change social sector fundraising, except for a few small crowdsourced startups. Nonprofit fundraising is still done via checks in governments. And let me add to that. Remember the Twitter revolution and how that was going to change the Arab world? Well, is blockchain another fad?
I would say absolutely not. I mean, again, if you talk to the banking industry, if you talk to all these other sectors, they're rapidly experimenting with and deploying new systems and to a certain extent, co-opting the technology. So if the big boys are, utilizing this new technology in lots of different ways, that tells you something right there. And even though in the social sector it's much less advanced, I would say, than in the private sector, similarly, I think, as these use cases come online, as we experiment and create, new opportunities and systems, blockchain is only going to grow.
I think you know my answer, not a fad.
Not a fad.
I think it's literally the greatest invention since the internet itself. Since the internet was created, I've been involved with it, 25 years here in Silicon Valley. I sold my stereo when I was a freshman in college, 1984, University of Michigan, to have an Apple computer. I've been in technology since then.
What was your aha moment for blockchain?
My aha moment was the architecture. We really are moving from a centralized architecture to a decentralized architecture. No more are third parties needed for the transactions and our communications and everything we do on the internet, right? We're really, when we're communicating, you and I communicating, it's going to be a communication from me to you, not an email that went to that server, sat at that company, is scanned by that one, sold out the back door to that one, right?
So you believe everything can be fundamentally disaggregated?
I believe that right now we're still going to rely on those service providers to provide those same services. Let's say Google, let's say Yahoo, let's say Facebook. We all need those services to connect to the businesses and organizations we want to. The key is rather than the pointers being to databases that they own, the pointers and the keys are going to be to databases that the individuals own. Yeah, that's going to be the fundamental shift. And so you're going to be involved not only in the ownership of the data, but then the ongoing monetization of the data.
Let me see if I can follow that, because I have talked to technology companies here that assemble things. And the idea that you could just keep your book kind of perpetually closed or perpetually up to date without having these 90 days a letter of credit, or I don't really know where my supplies are, they're somewhere in the Pacific. If you could have that kind of awareness of your entire system, it would completely revolutionize how you operate in ways they don't really understand, because it would change work itself to have that level of awareness. There's a great line IBM had that it takes, I think, 1.5 years to turn bauxite into a Coke can, but most of the time it's just sitting around waiting for the next person to pick it up. It doesn't really take that long to smelt aluminum and make a can, but most of that's waiting, which sounds really interesting, except a lot of the economy is predicated on things waiting around. So it would challenge a lot of industries. But you're talking over a 10, 20, 50-year curve, aren't you?
In some areas, but a lot sooner in others, right? In all the industries that I worked in, and mainly there's three: healthcare, financial services, and civic tech or democracy technology. The one takeaway is, if you're going to reduce costs, improve service, and generally improve that industry, it's get the data in the hands of the patient or the financial service person. You can't get good financial service advice until you've consolidated your personal balance sheet or income statement. Right now it's in little bits and pieces across your 20 different relationships out there. Same with your healthcare data, right? You can't get good health. You walk in and it's a blank slate. right? You're filling out a form and are you allergic to anything? You're starting from scratch. Because your data is fragmented across all those different relationships and sitting in their databases, rather than you having your history of all of your decisions that you've made with healthcare, for example, and the keys to that. So you can walk in and show someone the history. They can give you much better healthcare, cheaper healthcare, and then you walk away and you can even profit from that if a research company wants to buy your data or use it in some way. So.
I mean, I think we are years away in many areas. And just a data point, no pun intended, the Stanford Center for Social Innovation just came out with a report. They looked at 193 different social sector blockchain and cryptocurrency projects. And what they discovered was that over half of those projects will actually start to bear fruit by early 2019. And almost a quarter of them were doing things that you couldn't do without blockchain. So even though, yes, I think we are years away, there's still a lot happening. It's going to impact us.
Well, every success
4,
recruits
5
a true
years
believer
away.
too.
Correct.
And that, they go do something else.
Yep.
Whoever wrote this question, thank you, I guess. In a fully realized blockchain world, could Google and Facebook exist with their current business models?
No.
You here for my job?
With their current business models, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think they have to shift their business models, and they have to, like Facebook, for example, they have to do two things. Once it becomes what I would call kind of a utility, which I think Facebook has kind of become, you kind of need to hand the keys over to the users and open source the software.
Yep.
And I think that's the only thing that saves Facebook.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if you own your data and you decide where it goes, and you don't want to give it to Facebook or Google or anyone else, you want to sell it, somewhere else, and there are all kinds of new platforms that are gearing up to do that on the blockchain. When you're disintermediating again,
So
you have options to go elsewhere.
I downloaded my Facebook data a couple of weeks ago. I got to file number 2, and I noticed that they had copied all the phone numbers of all of my contacts and had them in their database, right? Like if I had a contact that had 8 phone numbers, those were all in there in Facebook's database. I stopped, I deleted Facebook, and I'm never going to use it again.
I think the question is not necessarily are they going to disappear or not. It's going to how are these companies going to evolve? Are they going to pay us for our data now that we own it, and they don't have the rights to it?
Yeah.
Maybe they will, and maybe that'll become
Again,
a new model.
there's a valuable service there, both Google and Facebook, and that is connecting us to those business relationships. But consider the users, the customers, and not the businesses. Right now, they're all doing deals, advertising and deals with businesses, and Google should be looking at the users as their customers, not those businesses.
I'm not going to speak for the head of Google and what they should do,
Let me add them.
because that would be a really bad idea. But I do think, going back to history, first off, strong incumbents tend not to go away. The Catholic Church is still here, right, despite all the rises of the nation states. And likewise, things don't arise out of nowhere. They have antecedents that morph over time. And the advertising business online has antecedents in direct mail marketing, or the rise of highly personalized consumption in the post-war world. We're dealing with that, and these companies will morph and adjust. Where I was going to go with Google, speaking of cloud computing, which is obviously an area I've joined because I believe this is powerful. Do you think the large data centers themselves, these global computing centers, will disappear and computing itself will become disaggregated?
No, the computing centers, I would look at that as functionality, right?
And
that
people will pay for that.
And people will pay for that, and businesses will pay for
Right.
that, and none of that goes away. And again, Google's doing great work and they're providing great services. It's just a matter of
Yeah.
focusing on who the customer is.
I wasn't
Yeah.
fishing for that as much
Well-
as, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there are some interesting business models that are developing around that in the sort of crypto blockchain world. There are companies that have developed tokens, and they what they do is they allow you to trade excess space on your computers. All right, you can basically rent it out to folks who need that.
Yeah.
For a token, that they are creating. So again, it's sort of an end run around some of the larger cloud providers. They're creating their own cloud, if you will, but it's still reliant on computers. It's still reliant on the internet as a layer underneath it.
I think that's possible, but even before that, you could find new methodologies to disaggregate physical goods. I came out of journalism. I was 20 years in there, and the problem with the journalism right now is it's been detached for advertising, and it can't really find its business model. People need to be paid for stories, and they need an effective, lightweight, frictionless even way of paying, and they will pay. They want to. They just don't want to have to sign up and click in and then look at an ad. It's preposterous. So perhaps a blockchain world, a disaggregated, transparent world is good for that. You could even see something like usage of highways or airports just being this kind of continuous toll where you're establishing value and value is being taken from your accounts for your and likewise a data center.
Absolutely.
Or anything else.
Yep.
Journalism, for example, I think there's going to be tremendous uses of blockchains there.
That would be a huge repricing of everything, though.
Well, not so much in the repricing, but more in the attribution and sort of the value that a journalist builds over time in reputation and their stories and pictures. Blockchains will be operating in real time so that as you're viewing something, you don't have to worry if it's fake news or not, right? You can almost see its history, and it's signed by you, for example, and people know your public key.
This gets a little bit away from the blockchain, but
but the blockchain enables that, right?
Attribution is a new form of literacy.
So
you
I think
have to know where
blockchains
facts come from.
really eliminate fake news, is the takeaway.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, there are all these interesting business models and opportunities going back again to disintermediation. Another example is in the music industry. And there are new platforms that are coming online that allow music producers to sell directly to consumers, right? And they can do that on a blockchain. The users can pay them a fair wage, if you will, for the music, again, because of all the money that would have to go normally to the music company, the production company, now you create more value for the producers of music. And
In an ideal world.
In an ideal world, but it's happening. It's already happening.
Another question. Is there a digital gap where the internet is widely available and where it is not? If so, how does this affect people's ability to access blockchain, and how do we overcome that? That's a good question, because the internet is available essentially in most parts of the inhabitable world at this point, but it's intermittent in some. The problem in some ways is connectivity, but the deeper problem is power. If you're in Africa, the lights just go out a lot. And if you don't have a solar charger for your phone, you're off for 10 hours.
But
I think it's a good point, but a very interesting element right there relative to blockchains is because they are distributed to everybody and everyone has a copy, the power can go out for a year. The internet can go down for a year. And guess what? When it comes back up, all those ledgers are the same, right? And that's an interesting element about it in places like that. So there you see blockchains where time can pass on and you might not update your node for a while. Your power might be out, but then you catch up once the power comes back on.
Yeah. But I think the nature of these ledgers compels continuous participation, and that will be a problem.
Right, but I think we're forgetting a really important element, which is mobile, right? Even though upwards of half the world doesn't have access to the internet, a lot more people have access to mobile phones and can bank on mobile phones and already are through blockchain technologies, exchanging money, dealing with remittances and all of those things. So it's not just the internet, it's other tools and platforms that can leverage the blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Are financial service companies afraid of blockchain or behind it? Well, any financial service company I've been with, the answer could be both.
Yeah.
I would say they're great for financial service companies. If you're a financial service company and you're just a third party, meaning in between a transaction facilitating something from a buyer and seller, you're not really in financial services, and you need to stop that. But there are a lot of cases where financial services are just that, offering financial services, looking at your personal balance sheet and income statement and give you financial advice and doing those sorts of things. So the financial service companies that are in that space actually giving good financial services are going to benefit. And those that are just out there collecting a toll, in between a transaction, those are not going to benefit.
That would be the both part.
Yeah.
Some countries, you want to get the currency or even want to send currency to them, there's a 5-day wait right now.
It's
This
a
makes
huge
no
cost.
sense.
It's a huge cost.
Right.
Yeah.
Or huge profit, depending where you are in the trade.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely goes both ways, right? On the one hand, financial institutions, they understand all the benefits of the blockchain, right? It creates new efficiencies, it lowers cost. They get rid of middlemen, right? Mm-hmm. And move money much more quickly and at a lower price than they could or they can't currently. But on the other side, we think of remittances that somewhere in the range of $30 billion a year goes to fees, right? Higher fees when it comes to the $450 billion that flow annually, remittances between different countries. And there's a company called Abra that claims they can lower that transaction fee by 90%. And if you're a company that's handling remittances, we know who those are, that's a scary thing, and that's a huge threat.
By the way, the quality of the questions tonight is exceptional.
Excellent.
When crypto philanthropy is done anonymously, how will we know what is the source of the funds? Who is the donor behind the gift?
Great question.
You could split up a $10 million donation and make it look like a bunch of people giving $50 pretty easily.
Yeah. Well, I see it as not that different from current philanthropy or donations. I mean, you can choose to be anonymous or not. And the same with blockchains. You can create, more public or private, blockchains and show whatever information you want. So I don't see it as a huge issue.
I think blockchains will fundamentally change taxation as we know it. I think that because one person can now send something of tremendous value to another individual, right? And the first thought that comes to mind is crime, but remittances is another one. So this ability right now, I say the sort of the technology's out of the bottle, the genie's out of the bottle here and you can't put it back in. Any individual can send any individual any amount of money. As a matter of fact, as a test for this, I sent you cryptocurrency earlier today without sending you keys and without sending you any notification, right? Mm-hmm. So right now you are in possession and only you can get to cryptocurrency that I sent you earlier today. I'll talk to you about it later, but there's an example where I think taxation changes and that you can't tax at that level, so taxation has to move up to what I would call the organizational level. Organizations, that's where all tax will be collected, and then it's going to have to move as a world up to that level.
What do you think will stand in the way of this? What will affect this and steer it?
Well, like always, fear of change. Existing established governments, and we do a lot of work internationally. U.S. isn't our first and foremost market.
Where banks are concerned, they'll want to be SEC compliant.
Well, in a
wherever
lot
they're
of
working.
these places around the world, it's a very corrupt regime that's basically in charge, right? And they're the ones that are going to be fighting it. You mentioned the Petro, Venezuela.
I wanted to get into that.
And it's you know, it's first of all a horrible cryptocurrency, right? And it's just a way for them to protect the control that they have.
Another question. Is there a concern about quantum computing and the impact it could have on the security of blockchain?
Yeah, well,
This is the new arms race. isn't
yeah,
it?
and Herb, you're an engineer. You can probably address this better than I can. But yeah, I mean, that's people talk about the blockchain being a system that's unhackable, and that's not true. I mean, it can be hacked. It's very difficult and very expensive to hack a blockchain. But the other threat, according to some people, is when quantum computing really appears on the stage, that the calculations can happen so quickly that it could actually allow someone to hack the blockchain. And Herb, I don't know if you want to
Or keep
get
things
into
off
that.
the, start to create discontinuities in what is supposed to be a real-time, ledger.
The robots are definitely taking over.
Bummer. But
I-
seriously, folks,
Yeah, no, I say that jokingly. I think at the end of the day, as much as we talk about decentralization, at the end of the day, even when you're conducting a vote, no matter what jurisdiction, at some point it becomes centralized. So humans stay in control for the foreseeable future. I don't think we have too much to worry about.
no, but can quantum computing in the hands of a bad actor or in the hands of a good actor change the nature of the blockchain, make it more safe, less safe?
Well, I think that the audit trail is going to save us, right? We haven't had that before. It used to be like whoever had control and could change that, that was it. You had no history. And I think a bad actor comes in and tries to change it, everyone has a copy of the history. I'm sorry, so you can put as much quantum computing against it. When everyone has a copy of it, it's harder and harder to game that system.
It occurs to me we have what I call the horseless carriage problem here. When cars came out, we didn't really know how to talk about them, so we took away the horse. It's a horseless carriage, and it's really nothing like that because it's a car, but you have to have a lot of roads and you have to have a lot of cars and then you have to have suburbs and fast food and radio and like all the things that go around a car before you have an appropriate language.
Right.
And it's almost like we're in this period, not just with blockchain, but in the technology generally, where we talk about surveillance or we talk about transparency, and they're both two sides of awareness because there's just so many ways to observe things now that there weren't before. Eventually this settles down, but that's kind of where we are in the world right now. We don't have good language for this, right?
That's right. That's right. Some people compare it to 1992, for example, when the internet was brand new, and people would try and talk about it, like what is this network, and people communicate, and how does that work?
Oh yeah, and all the web pages look like bad magazines or crap TV.
And it wasn't until you saw applications like web browsers, like email, like social media, that people understood it. And I think the point is, we don't need to understand all the things underneath it. Once the use cases and the user-friendly applications arise or come on the scene, that's when it becomes real.
Yeah, I think surveillance is very, very dangerous, and
It's the age of hyper-awareness. You can triangulate data and find out things people don't even know they're revealing.
yeah, absolutely. And all the data brokers going out there, that's exactly what they're doing, triangulating, coming up with more data, and then reselling that.
Individuals do it too,
Yeah.
searching each other's LinkedIn pages and then looking at their Instagram and then,
Yeah, so I would sort of take it a step further. So we see in Europe where they recently, they have tougher privacy laws there, and one of the things they've enacted is this right to be forgotten, right? And I think that's quite important that capability is there at the individual level. And as a matter of fact, I would take it a step further and and actually say it's a Fifth Amendment right. And if you think of Miranda rights, is the right to remain silent, right? Because the data will be used against you in the court of law. And I think that's where we have to enforce is that right, not the right to remain forgotten, but the right to remain silent, meaning I'm getting this health care because I have something wrong with me, and you shouldn't have that data because I came in for health care, right? That's my data, right?
So there's a right to be visible in that sense and a right to be forgotten. There's a right to autonomy over the self in a way that hasn't
There's a right to
existed
get
before.
health care that you pay for by keeping all the data and not leaving it behind where someone else can profit
Right.
from it or use it against you, which
Right.
often is the case in healthcare, right? You have certain diseases or you've had certain surgeries or certain things. Oftentimes it's that very data that's used against you. It's been used against me, right, in the healthcare system. And so it's that thing where I think it's not this right to be forgotten we need, it's the right to remain silent that we need.
Let me close with one last question. Will there be a mass tipping point of getting people to widely adopt blockchain? Will it come from the people or from companies? What do you think is going to, in your view, what makes this real?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to put your finger on a tipping point when that happens, and we still, again, I think, are years out from really seeing and understanding the implications of all this. But you know, let me give you one example. Again, going back to the social sector, if there are 65 million refugees, again, around the globe, many of them who do not have identities, they can't prove that they've been to a university, that they own property, you know, what services they've had or hadn't have. When we get to a point where any refugee or most refugees that don't have an identity that travels with them wherever they go, that's a tipping point, right? But there are lots of different tipping points in lots of different sectors, and it's hard to say, you know, when they'll happen.
I think we're already there as far as core usefulness, you know, and we're seeing it, you know, transform rapidly. One of our co-founders took the price of Bitcoin chart, and he flipped it and he said, don't look at it as the Bitcoin increasing, look at it as the fiat's decreasing, right? And I think that's what we're in the middle of. We're really in the middle of not only blockchains being useful at fundamental levels, but having impact in societies that we're seeing. And I also think it's going to change the way we organize. So what we think of stock markets today are going to change, and most organizations are going to be blockchain based in the near future. Well,
for me, we live in this time of enormous technology and virtual this and transparency that. But fundamentally, I'd look to the language again. I'd look to the physical world. When people start using it as verbs, when somebody says, that's in my ledger, or, I'll ledger that to you, that's a sign it's a permanent part of the landscape. Yep. Look to the language, look to how people act, and hope that they realize they're still going to have to be good, because none of this is magic. These are just tools.
Exactly.
Well, for those of you still in the room, we're going to open up to questions. I would like to say goodnight to our radio listeners and thank Paul and Herb for this excellent discussion. Many thanks to you at the audience for your terrific questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.